So today we're going over my top 5 hard mode formats. So the first one that I take the most pride in is my first playthrough also permadeath format, which these days I play almost every game in that format. I came up with this first in 2016, or at least I had thought about the idea for a long time, and then I finally did one, which was the original Diablo. So I'd never played the Diablo series at all, and I love Blizzard games, so I thought that'd be a good opportunity, and I even made my channel art to show off that that was my first one, but then I liked it so much I kept it. So the whole idea is you go into a playthrough completely blind, you know nothing about it, you don't take any advice, and you're allowed to basically do anything in the game, but you obviously have to come up with it yourself. So you might come up with some kind of cheese build or overpowered stuff, but you wouldn't feel bad about it even if you did, because that's intrinsic to the format, is that you only have one life, so there's no room for error. And it's also under the philosophy that most games are made to be able to be beaten without dying because they're just not that hard. So the alternative to this format is basically those are my two criteria for what I love about games. Is I love to get immersed in them and I love hard modes. So if you combine the two, you get this format. And so for games that seem like they're not suited for a first playthrough, also permadeath, where you are expected to die a lot, for example, Dark Souls, even the subtitle that the developers gave it was Prepare to Die Edition. And so the point is, if you assume it's going to be a game where you can't do this format, then the alternative is make it a hard mode. Now, how do you make a first playthrough a hard mode? For example, with Dark Souls, I did the one stat only first playthrough, or a class build, meaning like I choose one stat at the beginning and I can only get that stat and I can only use what that class should use. So if it's strength, you can only use two-handed weapons, you can't use shield, you can't use range, etc. So you go in with that mentality, so you still make a hard mode even out of a first playthrough, even if you're allowed to die. Just as an overall measure of the format, it makes everything so much more immersive. And it's especially cool in story games because you wouldn't really expect it, but I've done like Permadeath Phoenix Wright. That was a very satisfying thing. It takes whatever the game offers you and just makes it that much more immersive and tense and high stakes. It makes it feel actually like real life in a way. Like if you die, it's over and you can't do it again for, let's say, 6 months is what I do, but you can make it a year, you can make it forever. For the rest of your life, you can never play the game again, which would kind of go along with the philosophy of, you know, there's so many games out there, you'll never have enough time to play them anyway, so that puts it as a high stakes. If you really want to play it, you have to earn the right. Some of my biggest failures are falling off the chandelier in LA Noire after I was doing so good. Usually the stuff that ends the playthroughs is like something that is not intrinsic to the mechanics. So like in Danganronpa, I lose to the little DDR thing after the, you know, it's like a rhythm game after you beat the case. Or LA Noire, I fall off the chandelier. Those mechanics are not intrinsic in the game, or not what you'd expect, right? You would expect, okay, you have to solve the case, you have to answer questions, you have to interrogate people, you even have to do gunplay in LA Noire, but I wasn't expecting those mechanics. And so the first one I ever did was the original Diablo, which I did not complete. One of the more recent ones I did was Pokemon Y. And of course, you can expand the format. So for example, when I say I successfully beat Pokemon Y, it was only permadeath for my trainer. It wasn't for every Pokemon. So you could expand it and say, for games like that, not only is it a first playthrough permadeath, but it's also for every one of your units. Kind of like in a Final Fantasy game, if you were to say, like, if one of your units dies, they can't come back for the rest of the playthrough. Fire Emblem is a series that does that inherently already, right? If one of your units dies, you don't get them back. Which reminds me of a little bonus one. I would do a 2-player format for games that aren't actually 2 players. So for example, we did one of Path of Radiance where I had beaten the game, but she hadn't. So I let her have first dibs of what units to choose. So you basically split the units down the line. She would choose Shinon, I would choose Gatri. She would choose Ike, I would choose Soren, or something like that. You each get to choose the units. Of course, I was experienced with the game, so I gave dibs to them. And so if any units died, then it's on them, right? They lose a unit and you don't have to worry about it. You're kind of working together, but you're also kind of competing at the same time, and it's just a really fun dynamic to turn a game that's not normally 2 players into a 2-player game. And that's possible with almost any game where you control multiple units, and we did one with Pokemon Coliseum like that too, within a randomizer at that. But it was, you know, they get to choose of every set of 2 Pokemon that we get, they get to choose which one is theirs, and then we run with a set of 6 where we each control 3. That's the best game for it because every battle is a double battle. You always have both players in control, so you just pass the controllers around, or you can come up with a way to each have control at the same time. This is especially recommendable if it's a first-time playthrough, or at least it's a first-time playthrough for one of the players. It might not be as fun if you've both already beaten the game before. Next up, we have the Steam Gauntlet, or Xbox Game Pass Gauntlet, or the PSN PS Now Gauntlet. Originally, I did it with Steam. Basically, the idea is you go through a pre-established library of games in order, whether it be alphabetical or some other order, and you do each one as a permadeath playthrough or a hard mode of some kind. So with the Steam Gauntlet, I went through every game I owned on Steam one by one and either did a permadeath run, and if you fail, obviously you move on to the next one. If you succeed, you also move on to the next one, but it puts a certain amount of pressure on you. And again, with some games like Dark Souls and whatnot, it's more fitting to do a hard mode challenge with it rather than permadeath, so you can always do that too. I tend to reserve that for games that I've already beaten. Then it's not as fun to do a permadeath with it, in my opinion. The greatest thing about this format for me is that I usually always have a hard mode series going anyway. It has a bias for story games because I always like to have one story game and one hard mode, and even the story game tends to be a first playthrough permadeath. So in this case it would be, but it would be within the Gauntlet. You might think, oh, the Gauntlet ruins my format because now I'm going to be doing 2 hard modes at once, but you're more likely to die in a game that is actually combat based, so those will end quicker, and the story games will go on a lot longer, so it has a bias towards story games. But yeah, you basically go through in alphabetical order. Every game is permadeath or a hard mode. That's up to you to decide, but the best way to set it would be to say if you've already beaten the game, then you can make it a hard mode instead. It's amazing because there'll be plenty of variety, and it'll give you an excuse to play a lot of games that you might not have played otherwise. Number 3, Red Dead Bounty Hunter series or permadeath gameplay sessions. The Red Dead Bounty Hunter series was a pretty simple concept. Basically just trying to get your bounty as high as you can. So the focus isn't on doing missions or doing the story or anything else. You just literally play the game just to try to raise your bounty as high as possible, and you'll constantly get attacked by law enforcement in the process. And so if you die, originally your bounty goes back to 0 and you have to restart the whole thing. But then I adjusted it later on because that seemed too unfair, where if you die, you have to go back to where you started that day. So I did the same thing as Skyrim. It's like a permadeath session. In both of these cases, it seems too unfair. Like, if you played Skyrim for over 2,000 hours, you're not going to delete the character just because you die. So a true permadeath doesn't really work, but you can do it permadeath by each session, meaning you play the game for 5 hours one day, let's say. You can only save it at the very end when you're about to stop playing. So if you die 2 hours in, you're going to lose that 2 hours of progress and go back to where you started. So that's a good way to still put pressure and add meaning and weight to dying, where there's actually a penalty behind it, whereas otherwise there might not be if you're constantly saving it. So with the bounty system, it's the same thing. Like, let's say you start at 20,000 bounty, you play for 3 hours, you get up to 25,000, then you die, and then you play for another 2 hours to get it back to 25. You would have gotten a total of 10,000, but you only get to keep 5 because you failed somewhere in the middle there, and you're never going to be able to plan around for it. Like, oh, you can just quit if you feel like you're about to die. You have to end the encounter and actually stop playing. Number 4, the Blackout Challenge for Luigi's Mansion Super Hard Mode, or the hard mode within a hard mode. The idea with this is to take something that's already a hard mode version of a game, like Luigi's Mansion, where every ghost has 200 HP, and you're riding the vacuum, and you're in the hidden mansion, but to take it one step further. So you go in the Blackout, and you try to clear out the whole mansion of ghosts, every single room, one at a time, and so you're taking it kind of to an extreme, but that's always in the spirit of a hard mode. What also goes into this is sort of trying to play a game like Shadow of Mordor without using any counters. Or recently I've done one like in Plants vs. Zombies hard mode, where it's already a New Game Plus and it's already in the hard mode version of the game, but take it one step further. So you have to obey Crazy Dave's mandates for what you use. So like every level, he'll give you a set of 3 plants that you start with that he forces you to have as part of your rotation. And normally you could just ignore them or brush them off or restart to try to get a different set. But with this, you lock yourself into, you have to use those 3 plants and you have to fit them into your core rotation. So if he gives you a shooter as a plant, you have to use that one. And if he gives you other things, you have to fit them into your rotation. You can't just ignore them and use whatever is optimal. And it even goes so far as like enabling the special plants. Like you can only use a special plant that requires a base plant if he gives you the base plant. It's sort of just playing into the mechanics that the game is giving you, but to an extreme degree, where you're letting him dictate what you have to use. And last but not least, we have the Mario and Luigi No Level Run. This works for any of the Mario and Luigi series games, or any game where you can dodge attacks completely with an action command. So for example, in Superstar Saga, I called it the Master of Mitigation series, where since you can dodge every attack in the game, technically, you only fight bosses. So you ignore and avoid every single enemy in the game and you never level up, except for from boss fights. So it's the closest to a level 1 run of the game that you can do, because you'll only ever level up from boss fights. So you skip every enemy in the game and you fight every boss, and you can do it because you can avoid every attack. So it doesn't matter how weak you are, the fights will start to go on for a very long time and it will be very difficult, and you'll start getting one shot, but that's the whole pressure. It's almost like a hitless run in a turn-based game. Now, it doesn't work in games like Paper Mario because there, the action commands only mitigate a little bit of damage. They don't mitigate 100%. But any game where you can completely avoid an attack, it's perfect. You only fight bosses, and you have to really avoid almost every attack, eventually every attack, because they are going to start to one-shot you. So you don't level up at all, you don't fight trash enemies, you don't fight anything except for what you have to, absolutely, to beat the game. Oh, and just as a final bonus one, I'll apply permadeath criteria to secondary games that I play too. For example, with chess. As I'm raising my rating for the first time to new heights, like let's say 1600, 1700, as soon as I get to a 50 mark, if I fall below the 100 mark that I previously got to, then I have to delete my account on a particular website. So for example, if I get to 1650, now if I fall below 16, I have to delete my account. Either that, or you can just set a flat rating like, oh, if I fall below 1200 at any point, wherever, I have to delete my account. And in card games, I also set certain criteria. For example, if I can't win a tournament by X day in Pokemon Online TCG, I have to delete my account. Or even just doing round robins was always fun, like in NBA 2K. This is always a great format, just like if you can't decide what team to play on, like as an online quick match, you can just go in order and like play as each one until you lose. I had like a great streak of like 27 games in a row that I won with a particular team out of the blue as part of doing that. Not because I expected that to happen or anything, but it just, and so imagine out of all those games, you know, one game was a 15-point comeback in the fourth quarter, or like crazy moments will happen as a part of that, just dynamically, which is awesome. It gives you a fun way to mix things up in a multiplayer game, like you play as a character or a deck or a team until you lose as that team, and then you keep going automatically in order. So you don't end up playing as the same one over and over, even if you like them, or you're forced to play a variety, even ones you dislike.